Okay, so uh, for decades now, the assassination of JFK has just been this huge mystery, right?
Absolutely.
It's shrouded in all this secrecy, so many questions about what the government knew,
Right.
and maybe even more importantly, like what they chose not to reveal.
Mm-hmm.
So today we're going deep on a whole new batch of documents that just dropped,
Oh, wow.
trying to peel back another layer of this whole thing.
That's fantastic.
So what we're doing today is really digging into these files, looking at the information gathering and intelligence operations that went down in the years after Kennedy was killed,
Wow.
hopefully to see, what clues they might have about the information that they were collecting, how it was managed, and ultimately what might have been kept from you and me, the public.
Right.
So let's get into it.
Let's do it.
The first thing that jumped out at me was this system they had for tracking people
Oh, yeah.
called the 201 system or 201 system. And, it's funny. This is a document from 1974.
Okay.
It makes it clear this wasn't just like a casual list of names.
Yeah.
Right. This was a whole comprehensive method for identifying and keeping tabs on people who were considered, important to the intelligence agencies.
I see.
People who were the subjects of reports, counterintelligence investigations, potential recruitment, even members of groups that the agency had an interest in.
Wow.
It sounds like they were casting a pretty wide net.
Yeah, absolutely. Document 10417 not in Jake 717 Neuro54 really shows how complex this system was.
Okay.
Each 201 personality, and that's what they called them. Each person wasn't just a name, they had a whole record.
Interesting.
There was a unique 201 number, like a permanent ID.
Okay.
Then you had the 201 dossier, the official file, with everything bioinfo reports, the whole 9 yards.
Right.
But here's the interesting part. They also had a master 201 record, a machine-generated record for quick retrieval.
So they were thinking about accessing information quickly even back then.
Exactly. Even back then, it was about speed and efficiency. And if someone needed information, they would submit what was called an index search request and get back a main index 201 reference, basically a summary of what was in the system.
So it's kind of like a searchable database, but way before computers.
Exactly. A very early form of it.
And then they had these OI codes.
Right.
2-letter symbols attached to the 201 record to show if someone was suspected of being tied to intelligence or security services.
Uh-huh.
General codes and specific ones for different organizations.
Oh.
And someone could even have 2 codes.
Really?
It's wild how complicated this whole web of suspicion could get.
That is really something.
Makes you wonder how many innocent people got caught up in all of this.
Yeah, that's something to think about for sure. This level of detail could definitely lead to overreach.
Yeah.
The document also mentions a mechanized 201 index and 201 machine listings, again pointing to how much tech they use to manage all this data.
So how did someone actually become a 201 personality?
Right. What triggered all of this?
Like they weren't just opening files on random people, right?
Hopefully not.
The document says that 201 dossiers were usually opened for people who were the subject of counterintelligence information being reported.
Okay.
So people suspected of working against the agency's interests,
Makes sense.
or folks whose operational intentions needed approval.
Right. You'd need a file on someone you're going to use for something sensitive.
Exactly. But here's a key point. They specifically didn't do this for agency employees, staff agents, or most contract employees.
Oh, so this system was really focused on people outside their direct control.
Yeah, people they saw as important for security or operational reasons.
That's a big difference.
It is, and it makes you wonder what kinds of protocols they had for internal people.
Yeah, that's interesting. So what kind of stuff would you find in a 201 dossier? What were they actually keeping track of?
Oh, it's pretty in-depth according to this document.
Really?
First, you have the 201 personality file action request form, like the first step in the process.
Got it.
Then you have the bioinfo family education, known associates the whole deal. They also had personal record questionnaires, which I imagine were super long.
Probably.
Then you have any operational and security approvals name checks to see if they popped up in other investigations.
Wow.
And if they were using a fake name, they'd note that too.
That makes sense.
There were also 201 personality assessments,
What are those?
the agency's own evaluations and thoughts about the person.
Interesting.
And then things like contract papers, termination papers, agent duty status reports, training records, SGS WEPI-RRL reports.
SGS Wary RL reports.
Yeah, we think those are basically summaries of intelligence related to the person.
Okay.
Newspaper clippings, really anything that could help them understand the person better.
Wow, they were really thorough.
It was a huge effort to document everything about these people.
It's like gathering intelligence before you even need it.
Right.
So with all this information, they had to have a way to manage it.
Yeah. How did they keep it organized and decide what to get rid of?
Exactly.
Well, the document lays out some rules. They generally didn't like making copies to keep things under control.
Heart.
They used name trace forms to connect different pieces of info back to the same person, so they didn't accidentally create multiple files.
That makes sense.
Abstracts and dissemination notices kept track of who looked at and copied stuff.
Right.
And top-secret documents had even stricter rules, of course.
Of course.
There were rules for field files and duplicates, too, making sure everything was consistent and secure no matter where it was.
So how did they get rid of a file?
The desk officer had to decide if the material was still useful.
Okay.
Simple copies or name traces were easy to get rid of.
Makes sense.
But bigger things, like intelligence reports, needed a good reason to be destroyed.
So trying to balance keeping useful info and not holding on to stuff they didn't need anymore
Exactly.
sounds like a bureaucracy designed for control.
It does.
So we have some other documents that show how they got approval for covert operations.
Right.
This is where things get even more sensitive, right?
Definitely this document, 104, 178, 170 and 787-70. It's from 1958. It talks about the procedures for getting covert approvals.
Okay.
It talks about the chief of the counterintelligence staff and the director of security. They were the ones who could grant operational approvals and provisional operational security approvals.
So a clear chain of command and oversight?
Yeah, they weren't messing around with this stuff.
What kind of background information did they look at before they approved something?
Well, they wanted a full picture of the person.
Makes sense.
Biodata, who they hung out with, their reputation.
Police website.
Anything about their loyalty.
Trying to figure out the risks, right?
Exactly. You wouldn't want to use someone who might betray you.
So how did someone actually request these approvals?
You had to submit a formal request.
Okay.
And the Records Integration Division made sure they had all the background info.
So lots of vetting and official authorization.
And the document talks about getting approval for liaison with U.S. officials and even servants of agency employees.
It wasn't just about spies in other countries. This applied to a lot of different situations.
It does seem like they were trying to minimize risk.
Yeah, but it makes you think about what they were approving and what the consequences might have been.
Definitely. Now, there's another document, DOI 5010 from 1973, and it's about restrictions on using certain kinds of people for operations.
That's interesting, especially after the JFK assassination.
Right.
Makes you wonder who was off limits back then.
Yeah, so this document basically says that there were certain groups they couldn't use or needed special permission to use.
What could?
Officials and employees of international organizations like the UN,
Okay.
journalists and media people,
Oh, wow.
and members of educational and private voluntary organizations.
Journalists on that list is interesting.
Right, especially right after the assassination.
Yeah, were they worried about leaks trying to control what people were saying?
It's possible they were being very careful about the media.
Yeah, it makes sense. They wouldn't want to look like they were manipulating the news or accidentally reveal something.
Right, and the restrictions on using people from international organizations probably had to do with diplomacy.
Yeah, they wouldn't want to damage relationships with other countries.
Definitely. And the fact that this was all happening after the assassination is really important.
It makes you think about who they were watching and what limits they had on gathering information.
It shows how much they cared about public perception
Yeah.
and not looking like they're doing anything shady.
So a lot of rules and restrictions even while they were gathering all this info?
Yeah, it's a complicated picture. Let's talk about a specific case from one of the documents, 104 100092 10340.
Okay, what's that one about?
The Mexico City station and a guy named Hector Rafael Lapa Vasquez.
This would be right after the assassination.
Yeah, just a few weeks after this document is from October 1963.
Wow, so this is showing how things were working in Mexico City.
Exactly.
Okay.
So they wanted to run traces on Vasquez, and they started a preliminary operational approval, a POA.
So they were definitely interested in him.
Yeah, they wanted to learn more and maybe use him for something.
What did they know about him at that point? Why was he so interesting?
Okay, so he was born in Mexico City in November 1927.
Okay.
They had info on his wife, and they knew he had daughters who were U.S. nationals. They were also looking into his connections. A woman named Priscilla Lawaki and some people from a party he went to.
Okay.
And get this, Vasquez actually told the U.S. Embassy security officer about this party.
Wait, really?
Yeah, it happened a week before, and it involved some Soviet officials at his wife's hairdresser's apartment.
That's strange. Why would he tell them that?
Right. It's like he's hanging out with Soviets, but also wants to look cooperative.
Maybe he was playing both sides?
It's possible. So what else did they know about him? Well, he was a big-time journalist in Mexico,
Okay.
and they said he had extreme leftist views.
Oh, wow.
He was also the president of the Mexican Association of Journalists.
So a lot of influence in the media world.
Definitely. And the document mentions something called common ground between PORE and Ante, with the rest blacked out.
Probably political stuff they were interested in.
Yeah. So you have a journalist with leftist views, head of the Journalists Association, connections to Soviet officials. Definitely someone who would be on the radar, especially during the Cold War.
Especially after the assassination, too.
Right. So what did they think of him? Did they see him as useful or dangerous?
Well, they said that his letter about the party was successful advertising.
Successful advertising.
Yeah, the rest is blacked out, but it sounds like they thought he was trying to make himself look good.
Okay.
Or maybe trying to make a connection.
Right.
They also mentioned that he had access to the Palacio newspapers, which were conservative.
So he could reach a lot of different people.
Exactly. It seems like they wanted to use him for something, but the document says they didn't have the money.
Wow. So even someone with those connections and that access, if there's no money, they can't do anything.
Yeah, even in the world of spies, money matters.
It's a good reminder. This case really shows how those systems and restrictions worked in the real world.
It does. It's a snapshot of what was happening right after the assassination.
Okay, so as we wrap up, what are the main things you should take away from these documents? What were they doing and what were they hiding?
Well, these documents give us a glimpse into the intelligence world after JFK was killed.
Right.
The 201 system shows how much effort they put into tracking people.
Yeah.
They were worried about threats, and they wanted to know who their enemies were. And the restrictions on using certain people, especially journalists, shows they were worried about information getting out.
They were trying to control things.
Yeah, and the case of Rafael Vasquez shows how they investigated people with certain backgrounds and connections.
So those are the facts, but there's still a lot of questions.
Absolutely. What other systems did they have that we don't know about? What were they really thinking when they made those restrictions, and what happened with people like Vasquez?
These documents are just a small piece of the puzzle.
Right.
It makes you wonder what other secrets are still out there.
Exactly what else will we learn when more documents are released?
It's a mystery that's still unfolding. These documents are just a few clues.
Right.
So keep digging and see what you can find.
That's what we're here for.
Thanks for listening and keep exploring this stuff.
It's fascinating.
It really is.